Hi everyone, it's Graham here. Back in November of 2020, before I really had a channel, I posted a 15-minute video that explained who the passengers were on the Mayflower. That ship set sail in 1620, landing in Massachusetts, and would eventually become one of the founding groups of America. A lot of people were understandably curious about who was on that ship, especially because 2020 was the 400th anniversary of their arrival. And since then, the video has taken off and has really been the genesis of this channel. One of the regular bits of feedback that I get is that the camera wasn't held steady, and I was kind of shooting from the hip when I explained who all these people were. I got a couple of things wrong here and there that were corrected later in the video, and it was just really off the cuff. Turns out it was only because I was making that video for a friend, and I only posted it to YouTube because the video was too big for me to send as a text message. I didn't know it was going to lead to all of this, and it's been a fun journey over the last 4 years. But as I've said over the last year or so, I am sitting down to make a more stable version of the video with some more concise and specific information, so far as we know, about every one of these passengers. I'm drawing on a book by Caleb H. Johnson called The Mayflower and Her Passengers, as well as information on a website called the Mayflower Society, which also cites a fair amount of Caleb H. Johnson's research. So the credit goes to him for this, and if I get anything wrong, let's just assume that it's my error and not his. With regard to this specific poster, you can check the description for a link to it. It's available from thehistorylist.com. I am not compensated by them or affiliated with them. I've just got a copy of this poster in my house. It specifically highlights who died between their arrival in 1620 and the first Thanksgiving in 1621. And I think it's a great piece to have. So here we go. Alphabetically, our first passenger is John Alden. He came over alone at the age of 21. Within a year or two, he would marry another passenger, Priscilla Mullins. Alden was a cooper by trade. That means somebody who makes barrels. But he also had skills then as a carpenter. Next, we have the Allerton family. There was the father, Isaac, who was 32, the mother, Mary, who was 28, Bartholomew, who was 7, Remember, who was 5, and Mary, the daughter, who was 3. The mother, Mary, was pregnant when they came over. She was only a few months pregnant in July, but the delay complicated that. They originally set sail in early July, but there were 2 vessels, and one of them had some leakage problems. They kept having to go back into port and get repairs, and finally it was so late in the season that they just decided to cram as many people as they could from the second vessel, the Speedwell, into the Mayflower, and they still ended up having to leave about 20 people behind. And so then the crammed Mayflower set out 2 months later than they thought they were going to, and as a result, Mary was farther along in her pregnancy than she planned to be. The baby ended up being stillborn in December of 1620, and unfortunately, Mary would die a few months later in February of 1621. Isaac Allerton's job was to handle acquisitions and accounting for the colony, for the expedition, but according to Caleb Johnson, Isaac had a bad habit of abusing his position for personal gain. When William Bradford took over as governor, he replaced Allerton for the sake of the colony's finances. The Allertons also had 2 servants with them, named John Hook and William Latham. They were both around age 12. People who came over on servant contracts were usually tied to a family for a period of a couple of years, and at the end of that, they would get maybe a payout or some allowances. The contracts differed from time to time. But you'll see a number of these families that had servants attached to them of different surnames as we go down this chart. Unfortunately for John, he would die during that first big winter when most of the casualties took place. There was another Allerton named John, age unknown, but he was an adult. He was possibly Isaac's brother. Very little is known about him. He was a first winter casualty. The Billington family is one of the better known among the Pilgrims, but they have a reputation. John and Eleanor were the parents, with John Jr. and Francis being their sons. Their entire family survived the first winter, so that, coupled with their repeated rowdy behavior, made them unpopular with other Pilgrims. John Sr. was the first Plymouth occupant to commit a crime, that being military insubordination to Captain Miles Standish, and he was punished for it. Later, he would be executed for the crime of murder in 1630. With the Bradfords, you've got William and Dorothy, and William is probably the most well-known person of the Pilgrims associated with the Plymouth colony. William wasn't the group's governor at first, though he's better known because he kept records for Plymouth. His wife Dorothy died in November of 1620 while William was away on a smaller boat called a shallop, trying to pick a landing site for the Pilgrims. There's evidence to suggest that she actually jumped overboard from the Mayflower intentionally due to severe anxiety and depression, since she and William had to leave their young son in England until the following year. It is also possible that she just slipped off the deck, but either way, she drowned, and Bradford had a hard go of things without her. Next, we have the Brewster family, William and Mary, with their children named Love and Wrestling. William was old for the voyage, being 54, but he maintained good health. He was the colony's librarian. All of the Brewster family survived, but they did have two other children in their care, both of the surname Moore. There were 4 children from the Moore family in total, but not all of them were wards to the Brewsters. This is a slightly complicated situation here. The Brewsters had Richard and Mary. You'll see the other 2 kids, Ellen and Jasper, elsewhere on the chart. Caleb Johnson notes that these children were disowned by their mother's husband when he found out that none of them were biologically his. It was a sad situation for them to get punted for something that wasn't their fault. It was even worse that 3 of them would die in the New World. Only Richard survived, aged 6. There's a Richard Britteridge who came over alone. No other facts about him are confirmed. He died in the first winter. Peter Brown was another single adult man on the ship, probably in his mid-20s, not a servant. He would survive the first winter and even the first decade. He eventually died in 1633. John and Catherine Carver were 2 prominent figures in the colony, with John serving as the first governor. Although he survived the winter, he died that spring during the planting season, probably of heat stroke. Pilgrim Hall lists Jasper Moore as one of the Carver's wards, along with a young girl named Desiree Minter, or perhaps just Desire Minter. The Carvers brought 3 servants with them too, including John Howland, Roger Wilder, and a woman only known by her first name, Dorothy. Roger died in the first winter, and Dorothy died a few years later. Other than Dorothy marrying someone at Plymouth, nothing else is known about her. As to the servant John Howland, he's an incredibly consequential figure, namely because he fell overboard during the voyage and would have drowned if not for a rope hanging off the ship that would normally be tied to a cleat on the deck. Howland's direct descendants include several famous actors, 4 American presidents, and Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, who were the first 2 leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So his progeny has had a huge impact on American history. Next we have the Chiltons. James, who was the oldest passenger at 64, his unnamed wife, and their youngest daughter, Mary. Both James and the wife would die that winter. Sometime later, when Mary was between the ages of 16 and 20, not confirmed, she married John Winslow, who would come on a subsequent voyage. She lived until 1679. Then there's another single adult man, Richard Clark, who died in the first winter. Nothing else is known about him. Francis Cook came over with his son John, and they both survived. Francis's wife Hester would arrive 3 years later with the rest of their kids, and he would live to the age of 80. Young John would marry in 1634 and lived until 1695. There were 2 John Craxtons on the ship, a father and son. Unfortunately, the father didn't make it. The son moved in with the Allertons, and he stayed in Plymouth until 1627, when unfortunately he died of exposure after getting lost in the woods. Of the Eaton family, we have Francis, his wife Sarah, and their son Samuel, who was still nursing when they crossed the Atlantic. Francis Eaton was a carpenter, like John Alden. Sarah died that first winter, and Samuel would live until 1684. 2 more single adult men pop up here, a man simply called Ely, or Eli, perhaps, with no other information recorded, and one named Thomas English. Bradley writes about Ely and another passenger who returned to Europe after a brief period of servitude in Plymouth, so that could have been it. There were a couple of guys who were only there for a year, and then they went back to Europe. Thomas English, unfortunately, was not one of them. He died the first winter. Moses Fletcher was another well-known passenger. He was 55 when he came over. He was probably already a widower at that point. He and his wife had 10 baptized children. Prior to the Pilgrims setting sail for America, they had lived in Holland for a while, but they were worried that their descendants were becoming, basically going native, and so they set off for somewhere else where they wouldn't have the king looking over their shoulder, but they could also kind of establish their own influence. A lot of his children married and stayed behind in Holland, so he came to America alone. One of his religious beefs that I remember with the King of England was that he was excommunicated from the Anglican Church because he didn't want to follow Anglican burial rites for one of his deceased sons. So he joined up with the separatists, and unfortunately he died in that first winter. There were two different Fuller families on the Mayflower. Edward was the first, who brought his wife, with her name unrecorded, and his son Samuel. Edward and his wife were winter casualties. Young Samuel would then be taken in by his uncle, who was also named Samuel. So this wasn't a Craxton situation. They were both Samuel Fuller, but one was the nephew. Uncle Sam was a physician. He came alone, although he brought a servant named William Button. Sadly, Button died while the Mayflower was still at sea. Uncle Sam lived until 1633, and nephew Sam made it into his late 70s. And he has the historic distinction of being the only known Mayflower passenger to have owned a slave, in this case, a Native American. Richard Gardner is a single adult male who survived the voyage and the first year, and we don't have much beyond that. He died in 1624 and doesn't seem to have gotten a foothold in Plymouth. And there is indeed a John Goodman on the roster here, but Caleb Johnson says that finding out about him is tricky. He's thought to have died in the first winter, but someone with that name shows up later in the colony's history, so it's hard to say for certain. Other than the Billingtons, the Hopkins family is the only one not to lose anybody in the first winter. Stephen was an explorer who had been to America before Jamestown, and the Pilgrims hired him for his knowledge of the land and the people. His wife Elizabeth was his second, as he was a widower before. The Hopkins family sailed out of England with 3 kids, Damaris, Constance, and Giles, while Elizabeth was pregnant with a son who was born on the Mayflower, and that baby born at sea was named Oceanus. Hopkins is a significant figure in Plymouth history and has a few books written about him. Again, see the description in the end of the video for the links. He's a very interesting person. Hopkins also brought 2 servants, both named Edward, one Doty and one Lester. They were known troublemakers, and they tended to run afoul of the rules in Plymouth. I think I said erroneously in the original video that they were screwing around with fowling pieces. I got that mixed up with somebody else. They were caught dueling once, though, with a sword and a dagger. They did eventually shape up, and they became productive members of society. They were just rowdy teenagers, as many tend to be. Edmund Margeson is one of many single adult males who came over alone and died in the first winter. That's all we know. Under the Martin family, we have Christopher, who was a church warden and a Puritan who disagreed with the practices of the English church. There's a lot of those on this boat. His wife Mary and his stepson Solomon came with him, plus a servant named John Langmore. Unfortunately, this whole family were first winter casualties. And then the Mullins family nearly met the same fate as the Martins. Father William was a shoemaker, and he was near 50 years of age. His wife Alice is a mystery, and there are many theories about her maiden name. The Mullins brought 2 kids, Priscilla and Joseph, plus a servant named Robert Carter, and other than Priscilla, all of them died. But this is the Priscilla Mullins that would go on to marry John Alden. Deggery Priest is sadly another single man who didn't make it through the winter, but he left a wife and 2 kids behind in Europe. He was a hatter by trade, though I suspect that wasn't what drove him to join the Pilgrims. I'm not sure how much practicality that trade would bring them in the New World. John and Alice Rigsdale, married, likely in their 60s, died the first winter. The Rogers family, they had Father Thomas and son Joseph. Thomas's trade was in fabrics. He was a first winter casualty, but Joseph would survive to be a productive colony member. Miles Standish, another significant name here. He was in his early 30s, and despite his short height, he was a worthy and valuable asset as a military leader. He'd even undergone, if I remember right, military academy training in the Netherlands, and he applied that with the layout of the Plymouth colony. It was originally set up a little bit more as like a military outfit than a traditional town hall. I believe it was Nathaniel Philbrick who covered that in his book. Again, Longfellow would imply that Standish and Alden were in a love triangle with Priscilla Mullins. This would just a fictionalized account. Standish's first wife was named Rose. She was a first winter casualty. His second wife, Barbara, arrived on another ship a few years later. Although he provided much needed security and fortitude to the colony in its early years, he had a reputation for a short temper, and he was, according to Johnson, reprimanded even by his friends for being too harsh in dealing with violent Indians. Such was the time period, but the fact that his own friends were willing to criticize him says something about his intensity. There were two Tilley families on the ship. Edward and Agnes were the first. They brought two wards named Humility Cooper and Henry Sampson. The wards survived. Edward and Agnes did not. Humility was only 2 at the first Thanksgiving, so she was still a toddler when she came over. Agnes was her aunt, and at the age of 8, Humility would return to London. Henry was also a nephew to Edward and Agnes, though he was 19 when he arrived, and he stayed until Massachusetts until his death in the 1680s. At one point, the Family Search database, where I have my genealogy link, listed me as a direct descendant of Sampson, but that database has since updated and the connection is no longer there. More on that at the end of the video. The other Tilley family was John and Joan, with their 13-year-old daughter Elizabeth. As it was with the older Tilleys, these adults perished in the winter and the daughter survived. Elizabeth would go on to marry John Howland. Pilgrim Hall lists his age as 28, while Caleb Johnson puts him as 21 in 1620. So that's a difference of half your age plus 7 and straight up half your age. So for what it's worth, I'm hoping Johnson was right, that Howland was only 21 when he came over. But his research seems pretty good so far. The Tinker family, there were 3 in total. Only the father's name is known, Thomas. His wife and son are both unnamed in the records, and they died in the first winter. William Trevor, or Trevor, sometimes it's spelled with an E on the end, is one of the few bachelors who made the trip and had a decent go of it, although he didn't stay in Plymouth. He just did a year of service, and then he returned to Europe for a career as a sailor. Much like the Tinkers, John Turner came with 2 sons whose names are unknown, and unfortunately all 3 of them died the first winter. I seem to remember reading somewhere, even before I picked up Caleb Johnson's book, that all of the casualties were adults and none were children, but that hasn't been the case. There were unfortunately plenty of children that died before they got to live their lives here. Richard Warren came alone, but he wasn't a bachelor. He had a big family back in England, and they showed up 2 years later, bringing 5 daughters to the mix. Richard died in 1628 at the age of 49. His descendants include 2 U.S. presidents, that's Ulysses Grant and FDR, as well as Alan Shepard, the first American to go to space, and he was also on the list of men who walked on the moon. The White family consisted of William, Susanna, Resolved, and Peregrine. Susanna was pregnant for the crossing, and she was the first pilgrim to give birth at Plymouth to the aforementioned Peregrine, which is a name that means pilgrim. William died that winter, and Susanna would go on to remarry Edward Winslow. More on him in a minute. The Whites also brought 2 servants, William Holbeck and Edward Thompson. They didn't survive the winter. Thomas Williams is another in the long, sad list of single men who passed away that winter. He was about 40 years old. That's all we know. The Winslow family. This is a significant one in the annals of Plymouth. Edward came with his wife Elizabeth, with 1 ward, and with 2 servants. Their ward was the 4th Moore child, Ellen, who died in the winter. Of the 2 adult male servants, George Sewell survived and Elias Story did not. Edward was the 3rd governor of Plymouth, and in between 2 stints from William Bradford, he made a few back and forth trips from America to England on business. Remember that part of the reason there was a commercial expedition. There were separatists who were there for religious liberty, and then there were what they called strangers who were there for business and for commerce. After Elizabeth died, Edward married Susanna White and became a stepfather to Resolved and Peregrine. And this brings us to the final passenger, another Winslow named Gilbert, who was Edward's younger brother. He didn't stay too long, and he was probably back in England after just a few years. Finally, there was one crewman from the Mayflower who decided to stay in America. His name was simply John Clark. He was an accomplished sailor and a pilot. He was in charge of the shallop that William Bradford and a few other men were on that set off from the Mayflower to try to find the most ideal landing spot for them. The Mayflower had originally been destined for Virginia, but their late departure and the seasonal storms forced them to land farther north. Clark did what he could to help the Pilgrims, and they later named an island for him. Unfortunately for Clark, although he didn't return to Europe, he didn't set up shop at Plymouth either. He went to Jamestown, where he was one of the casualties of the 1622 massacre by the Powhatan Indians. So that's a little bit longer and more detailed and therefore more accurate breakdown of who the first colonists were there at Plymouth Plantation. I've got my genealogical information logged in on FamilySearch.org. I understand that there are a bunch of different websites that people can use for that. It is connected to a constantly updating database, though, called RelativeFinder.org. So if you've got your family history in Family Search, you can access the database on Relative Finder, and it'll isolate different groups. Like you can find out if you've got any connections to signers of the Constitution, signers of the Declaration of Independence, U.S. presidents, actors, writers, whatever. There's a category on there for Mayflower passengers, and that's how I know what my connection is at any given time, provided the records are accurate, to different people who were on the ship. For the most part, I'm a slightly distant cousin to anywhere between like 3 and 7 of the people who were on there. At that one time, it did have me listed as a direct descendant of Henry Sampson, but I think there are so many people updating historical documents and tangential family information within the database that that connection can change. You can download a PDF of the connection if you find one, and then if you've got your own historical sources or family history sources that you can use to reinforce that connection, that's great. But a lot of people in the comments of that original Mayflower passenger video would say that, oh, my grandma told us that we were descended from this family or that family. I would encourage you to do whatever homework you can to find whatever resources are available to you in your area or online to solidify that connection and find out through which family line you're directly descended from or connected to whichever member of that ship. Studying history like this helps you to feel more connected to your predecessors, and for me personally, it's given me a motivation to live up to being worthy of the effort that they put to secure the freedoms that they didn't have in England. As for the books, here are the books that I've read over the last 3 or 4 years that I found especially beneficial when studying the Mayflower. The first is, of course, The Mayflower and Her Passengers by Caleb H. Johnson. He wrote another book called Here Shall I Die Ashore, which is mostly a biography of Stephen Hopkins, and it gets very detailed in the years between 1620 and 1622 or so. There's a lot of month by month and even week by week information about what he was doing on the Mayflower and what he was doing with Plymouth Colony. You also get a glimpse at what his life was like before that. He was an explorer who went to Jamestown. That was why they hired him, and it made him valuable to the colony. He also had some familiarity with different Native American languages. That kind of all went out the window when they ended up away from Virginia and up in Massachusetts, which brought them in contact with a different language tree and different customs, but he did what he could. Fascinating figure. A Stranger Among Saints by Jonathan Mack is also a book about Stephen Hopkins, and I've found it valuable to read the research that different authors do on the same figures because they'll highlight different things, and you can get a more well-rounded picture of different people and different events by doing that. Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick does a really good job of giving you some technical details about the geography and the topography and the sailing and what we know about the Wampanoag Indians pre and post Plymouth contact, and he even takes it all the way up to the King Philip's War, which happened 50 years after the Mayflower landed. Naturally, Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford is an indispensable resource. That one was a manuscript found, I believe, sometime in the mid-1800s, which filled in a lot of gaps in historical knowledge. It was recorded by the man himself and covers about the first 20 years of the colony. The Mayflower and Her Log by Ezell Ames. This one has a lot more of the history of the ship itself, as well as what we know about the route that it took, the day-to-day operations of the vessel, and how it was ultimately sold for scrap lumber in 1624. But that one gave me some extra insights and information to the age that I was not aware of at the time. The Mayflower, The Families, the Voyage, and the Founding of America by Rebecca Fraser is the single best book about the Mayflower and the King Philip's War that I've ever read. I believe Philbrick's book is good. I believe Fraser's book is great. She goes to incredible effort to be objective and thorough in her recording of how this conflict came to be, what were the European influences on it. Uh, England went into a period of interregnum and civil war. The economy was interrupted. That led creditors to kind of tighten their grip on their colonial assets. There was a great haste amongst colonies to expand their holdings, to buy more land from the Indians. Chief Massasoit wanted to sell more. He was fine with that. His kids wanted that land back. Conflict arose. The Plymouth settlers did stuff they shouldn't have. The Wampanoags did stuff they shouldn't have. Things escalated as they do, and when it came to all-out war, the Wampanoags lost. I think Rebecca Fraser does an exemplary job of being fair in her treatment of that, and doesn't portray it as, one side being right and good. It's just here's what happens when you put two incompatible systems on top of each other, and this was the inevitable result. I highly recommend you read that. And finally, at the time of this recording, I'm reading a book right now called Project Mayflower by a man named Stone, which is just fantastic. It is about an effort in the 1950s to build an authentic replica of the Mayflower and sail it using period-accurate methods from England to the United States, where it would then become an exhibition piece in Massachusetts. And I'm about a third of the way through it so far. My brother gave it to me for my birthday, and it's just been fascinating to read about the men who undertook this effort to try to preserve this methodology and increase attention on this period of history more than 300 years after it happened. And now here we are, 404 years after the Mayflower first arrived. This was a very consequential and significant event in the history of our nation. And the more I study the details of it, the more fascinated I am and inspired I am by all the figures that participated in it. The separatists, the saints, the natives, all of that. And I highly recommend you guys check all that stuff out. Let me know what you think about all this. I appreciate you guys watching the original video and this one. And by all means, subscribe to the channel. I don't usually do a whole lot of content like this, but I've got a soft spot in my heart for the Mayflower, and I'll probably continue reading whatever books I can find on it. It's been fantastic. If you've got a recommendation, let me know. I post videos quite regularly on here about books that I've read. I make recommendations myself, and I just try to find things that I like and boost them. So thanks again. Till next time, drive safe. See you out there.